Enough time. Let's get started. So today we're here to talk about E2 visa renewals, right? So some of you already have E2 visas. Some might still be working on the original E2 and you want to know, how is this going to affect me once the time comes, right? So that's great. That's forward thinking and a lot of planning, which is fantastic. But some of you already have E2s and maybe renewals are coming up and coming upon you. So in that instance, I want to answer some of those questions as well. So if you have any, please feel free to put the questions in the chats and I will answer them as much as I can. But let's just talk a little bit about the basics of an E2 renewal, right? So kind of the first question, of course, would be, when is the E2 renewal? When do I need to renew this thing? And the answer is, it depends on where your passport's from. So the United States has treaty agreements with countries all over the world, as you probably know, and those treaties dictate the amount of time that the visa is good for. So there are a few countries, Egypt, Jordan, I think Ukraine now, there's a few different ones, a little bit here and there, that are good for 3 months. Bangladesh, they're good for 3 months. That means that you have 3 months after your interview to enter the United States. You can stay for up to 2 years, but if you leave during that time, you will need to renew before you can come back. Okay, those are the least flexible E2 treaty visa countries. There are a handful of them. And then on the other end, the most flexible allow for multiple entries, come and go as you please, for 5 years. Okay, so there are many of those countries as well, right? Canada, the UK, Australia just moved to 5 years. There are a variety of them. And then some people are in the middle. Maybe they have 2 or 3 years, multiple entries, that kind of thing. Okay, so it really depends on where your passport's from. Now, obviously, you're going to look at your visa and there's going to be a date on that visa. That is when you can no longer enter the United States using that visa. So for those of you who travel, that type of thing, you'll probably want to renew. So you're always going to be able to have that travel flexibility. I'm not going to get into the I-94s and all of that in this webinar because it's just a little complicated and it kind of is a case-by-case basis. But just so you know, you can always look at your visa. It's going to have that expiration date on it, and it's going to be anywhere from 3 months to 5 years. Okay, so that will really give you the best idea about when you're going to need to renew. So when you're getting your documents together, how soon do you need to start planning for your renewal before you submit those documents, get your interview, and that type of thing? So again, a little bit of a case-by-case basis, but I always recommend checking in with your attorney 1 year before the renewal. Why is that? Because some of the documents that you're going to need for a renewal, you still have time to make some changes. Let me talk to you a little bit about what I mean. Let's just say that your visa expires August 1st of 2025, right? It's about a year from now. So one of the things that most countries require upon renewal is your tax returns. Well, here's the good news. You're not going to file those tax returns. You've still got another 4 years or 4 months of making money, right, till the end of the year. Then you have a few months after that before you have to file your taxes. So if we talk right now and I say, hey, what's your renewal or what's your revenues looking like for 2024? And you say, not so great, but we have something coming up in November where we're going to have a big order or something like that. Great. And let's talk a little bit about that. Because you may be able to get that done before December 31st. That means when you apply next year and you have your 2024 taxes as part of your renewal package, we will have done a little bit of planning and strategy to get as many of the revenues in 2024 as possible. So when you go to renew, you've got a really good tax return, right? We also want to talk, because what does your accountant want to do? Sometimes your accountant has the exact opposite goal of what immigration is, because they want to make sure that you have the least amount of revenue, right? Because they want to show that you owe the least amount of taxes. That's their job. Well, in the immigration world, we want to show higher revenues. So we need to talk a little bit about that. Also, if I called you or if you called me today and you have this renewal in August of 2025, I'd say, great, how many people do you have on payroll? Well, I really only have one, but I have a couple of contractors. I'd say, fantastic. You still have time to get those contractors on payroll. So at the end of the year, you'll have multiple W-2s. That's going to help your renewal, right? So it's always good to check in at least a year, at least as an initial check-in, a year before your renewal date. Okay, that's the first time I'd have you check in with your attorney. When should you start gathering documents and getting everything together? I would say probably about 6 months before your renewal date, because what you don't want to do is file right before your renewal date, and then maybe it will take 3 or 4 months to get an interview or to get that interview waiver. And you don't want to be kind of stuck and in limbo during that time. So I always recommend check in about a year before and then start gathering the documents and working toward your renewal about 6 months before your expiration date. Okay, so that gives you a little bit about the timing of the renewals and that type of thing. So we have a few questions here, kind of, but some of them I'm not able to see. Oh, okay. So these are asking about initial E2 approvals, which is fine. We can talk about that a little bit later. But if anybody has anything specifically for a renewal, that's what this call is about. So let's talk a little bit about some of the requirements, right? We talked a little bit about the timing, but let's talk about requirements. In most countries, you're going to need to supply 2 years, sometimes, well, let's say between 1 and 3 years of tax returns. Okay. So every country is a little bit different, but what we really want to see is between 1 and 3 years of tax returns, depending on where you're from. And again, they're going to want to see the most amount of revenue as possible, right? So they don't want all of those write-offs. They want to look at that tax return and make sure that you are making money. But here's the good news. So for some of you who have to renew after a year or two, something like that, they're not expecting tons of revenues and tons of employees. When they're starting to expect revenues and employees that are kind of where the business is going, it's making money, you have employees, you're paying those employees, is 5 years, okay? But for those of you who need to renew after a year or two, you still should be showing that you're moving in the right direction, okay? So we really want to see that. Like, we need to show that you're moving in the right direction, that things are better than when you started, okay? So kind of keep that in mind as well. All right, a couple little updates here. Do I need a business plan for renewal? Good question. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? That's the worst answer, and almost all attorneys give that answer for everything, right? This is why we're the worst / the best, because we're trying to be helpful. But sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Normally, if you have fewer than, let's say, just a benchmark number, $500,000 or $600,000 in revenues, and you have fewer than 5 or 6 employees, I will normally include a business plan that shows here's where we started, here's where we are now, here's our plans for the next several years. Okay. But I've had renewals that I did not submit a business plan. I've had companies that were making $25-30 million in revenues a year, had 25 to 30 employees, that kind of thing. I did not submit business plans for things like that. And even if you have lower, right? So let's just say you have $800,000 or $900,000 of revenue, you have 9 employees, something like that. Maybe not. It may not be that important to show a business plan. If you have fewer than $500,000 or less than $500,000 in revenue and fewer than 3 or 4 employees, for sure, I'm going to include a business plan. So they can see, okay, it's taking a little longer than we thought, but we are moving in the right path, and we do have these plans for the next couple of years. So yeah, let's see. Okay, lots of questions about Andrew and Medina and Paradigm. Those are for new E2 applications, and I will answer those questions when we get to the end if we have time. But we do have another question. If they're an interview at the renewal, the answer is sometimes they do have the authority to waive your interview, meaning you send in your documents and they may say, you know what, we understand, we got it, but you'll need to mail in your passport. That's the key, right? So you cannot mail your passport internationally. So keep that in mind. So if they say, let's just take a really specific example, right? Let's say that you're in the United States and you are renewing in France. Okay. And so we will email your documents over to the US Embassy in Paris. They're going to review them. And then they say, you know what? We understand your plan. We feel like you're moving in a right direction. we'll go ahead and waive that interview. You don't need to attend the interview. Please send in your passport, your fees, blah, blah, blah. Well, the issue, of course, becomes, okay, well, but I can't be here without my passport and I can't mail my passport internationally. And you would be right. So you do need to be there while you kind of wait, which is kind of a bummer, right? Because you definitely don't have to go into the embassy, but you still have to send your passport, which means you kind of need to be there. So it does save you from going in, and it kind of saves you a little bit from the stress of the interview, but you're still going to have to be in your home country maybe for a week or two while you send in the passport. They put the visa in it, send it back to you, then you bring it back to the US. Okay, so there's something like that. Okay, so here we have, what if you got your E2 but couldn't actually use it, and then E2 expires? No, you would probably need to. Okay, so the question is, I applied for an E2, I got an E2, and then for a variety of reasons, I never used it. I never came to the US, we never operated the business, that kind of thing. You would start from scratch, okay? But just know that at that interview for the second one, there are probably going to be some questions about it, right? They're probably going to be like, well, what happened to the other one? Well, why didn't you ever use it? Well, how am I going to know that you're going to use this one when you didn't even use the last one, right? So something kind of to keep in mind there. So let's see. Oh, one thing I did want to mention about renewals, and this is a somewhat of a change with renewals in the last year or two. Sometimes they update FAM, and I never know, I can't ever remember when they did that because they don't make any fanfare, they just update it. So one of the updates they made within the last year or two is on your renewal, they're supposed to take your evidence of investment at face value, which means if the first person who did your first E2 said, hey, this is a substantial investment, I understand it, your evidence of investment requirement is met, that on renewal, we do not have to rehash that. Okay. We just, for some people, we just skip it. Now, we have a current renewal right now that has invested a significant amount to the tune of something like an additional $2 to $3 million after the initial application. In that instance, we do want to show that because we want to show they're continuing to invest, right? It kind of builds the strength of this renewal because that company doesn't have as many employees maybe as I feel like would be what I consider a slam dunk on renewal. And so we're trying to strengthen the application a little bit. So in that one, we're going to show, hey, they originally invested about $2 million, and since the initial approval, they've invested an additional $2 million. And here are some of the things that they purchased: some larger, orders of inventory equipment, that kind of thing. So in some instances, we would get into that, but for your standard E2 visa, we're not going to really get into the how much you've invested since, or that even arguing that it was initially a substantial investment, because in FAM, of course, they have to now accept that whatever the initial investment was, it was substantial at that time, and that requirement has initially been met, and you don't have it was substantial at that time, and that requirement has initially been met, and you don't have to reprove that. Okay, so that's an interesting development in renewals. Oh my gosh. Let's see. What else do we have here? Oh, right. So we do have a question about the timing. So yeah, you want to reach out to, just to kind of reiterate, you do want to reach out to your attorney about a year before your renewal, just to make sure that you're on the right path, talk a little strategy, figure out what you need to do. That gives you a little bit of wiggle room to try to adjust some of your documents. So at the time of renewal, they're going to be more approvable. Okay. But then you need to start gathering those documents and working towards your renewal about 6 months in advance. That's always kind of the timing that I recommend. Okay. So we're going to go another 5 minutes-ish or so, unless I get some really good renewal questions. Right now, most of the questions are actually about the initial E2, which is okay, and we can answer a few of those while we wait. But if anybody has any renewal questions, I would ask that you send them. And is there always an interview for renewal? No, there isn't. They can waive that, as we just discussed about that, but just keep in mind that sometimes you still have to be in your home country because you can't mail passports internationally. You're not supposed to do that. And you have to send your passport in because they have to put the new visa in. Okay, so something just to kind of consider. Okay, I guess we will talk a little bit about initial E2s, which is fine. We do those all the time, right? Let's see. Okay, so for $100,000 investment includes assets like vehicles. So you can include vehicles. However, we only allow vehicles to be included if they're part of the business plan. And so what do I mean by that? If you have a company that does deliveries, then obviously, right? Because part of the way that you're making money is by the driving. But for example, if you have a marketing company and you're just like, I'll just buy like a Toyota Camry and that'll be part of it. No, we don't allow for that because that's not really about the business, right? That's your personal car. You're kind of trying to put as an expense onto the business, but it's not really added to the development of the business, right? The growth and development of the business. So that's part one to your question. Part two is, can we use the whole value of the car? Only if you've invested it, right? So if you have a lease, let's say that you get a new Mercedes Sprinter van because you have a lot of deliveries and those are the really tall vans, right? It's not a personal use car. It's for the business specifically. And let's just say that you're buying a used one and it's $65,000. If you pay the full $65,000, then yes, we can use that. But let's say you're leasing a brand new one and your lease is $1,100 a month and you've paid for 3 months of lease, we can use $3,300. Okay. So only what you've paid. Let's see. What else do we have here? Dependents over 20, dependents except for spouses can never work on E2 visas. So your spouse will have the authorization to work, but your kids will never have the authorization to work, no matter what their ages are. They won't. Okay. Let's see. You got it, Andrew. So another difference, of course, is whether you're renewing through USCIS or you're renewing at a consulate or embassy around the world. Okay. If you are applying at the same place you applied for your initial E2, it will be what we would consider a standard renewal. But let's take this scenario. Let's just say that you originally got your E2 visa in the UK. Okay. And now it's been 5 years, but for whatever reason, you don't want to go back to the embassy. You just want to extend your status here in the United States. You will have to treat that application as if it's a new application because you have a new entity reviewing it, right? So keep in mind that at the U.S. consulates and embassies, the entity that runs those is under the Department of State, right? That's a different department. The people who run USCIS, that's the Department of Homeland Security. So these are separate departments. So if you've only applied at the consulate or embassy, and then you want to renew through USCIS, you'll have to treat it as almost like a new application because they've never seen any of your documents before. And the same is true vice versa, right? If you originally got your E2 status through USCIS, meaning you did not leave the United States, you did not do an interview, you applied while you were here, and now you say, okay, it's been a couple of years, now I want to go to the UK and apply at the US Embassy in London. You can do that, but you do have to treat it almost like a new application because they've never seen your old application. They see that you have status, but they've never seen the documentation, and they don't have to rely on USCIS's initial approval in order to approve. Because the reality is these two different entities, they do adjudicate somewhat differently. Okay, they put emphasis, the requirements are the same, but they put different emphasis on the different requirements. Okay, something to kind of keep in mind. Final question here about renewals, and it's a good one, is if you applied for one type of business and then you changed your business in the middle and you changed the type of services you're offering or what you're selling, That is something to let your attorney know before you do that. If you've already done it and kind of we have to go back and fix what's done is done kind of thing. Yes, that's going to come up on renewal, right? Hey, you originally applied with this dog walking service and now you're in construction. So depending on the facts of the case, do we apply for a new E2 or is it a renewal? How do we kind of spin this a little bit? Because really you're not supposed to be doing that, right? So that makes it a little more complicated. So if you are considering doing that, please talk to your attorney first before you do anything. If you've already done it, what's done is done, talk to your attorney as soon as possible because your attorney is going to have to strategize a little bit on renewal, how to spin it to make it seem that you've always fit the requirements, you continue to fit the requirements, and it's the same business, only a little different, right? Because you don't want to just go in blind, in other words, right? You don't want to do that. So with that, that's going to wrap our renewal today. Thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate it. If you're still considering your first E2 visa, please reach out. We didn't talk a lot about it today, but I promise you, I'd be thrilled to speak with you because we do it all day, every day. If you already have an E2 and you need to renew within the next year, please reach out so you can talk a little strategy. We can strategize a little bit and make sure that this renewal goes as smoothly as possible, right? So always reach out via email if you wish, rupert@rupertlawgroup.com. Of course, you could WhatsApp us or fill out the questionnaire online, whatever you've got. We'd be thrilled to talk with you about your E2 visa or E2 visa renewal. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Thanks so much.